There is a particular kind of distance that doesn't look like distance at all. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a fight or a betrayal or a moment you can point to and say, that is when everything changed. It arrives quietly, incrementally, in the space between two people who are still sharing a home, still sleeping in the same bed, still exchanging the functional words of a life lived in parallel. It arrives in the pauses that last a little too long, in the questions that stopped being asked, in the conversations that begin, and then, almost imperceptibly, almost without either person noticing, simply stop going anywhere. This is the invisible wall, and it is the most misunderstood phenomenon in modern marriage. Most people, when they think about a couple that has stopped talking, imagine something dramatic, a cold war, two people pointedly refusing to speak, moving around each other with the brittle precision of people who are actively, consciously withholding. But that is not what the invisible wall looks like in most marriages. In most marriages, the couple hasn't stopped talking at all. They talk every day. They discuss the children's schedules and the grocery list and the thing that happened at work and the neighbor's renovation that has been going on for months. They talk constantly, efficiently, functionally, and they are, in the truest and most devastating sense of the word, not communicating at all. Because communication, real communication, the kind that keeps two people genuinely connected across the span of years and change and difficulty, is not the exchange of information. It is the exchange of inner life. It is the willingness to say not just what happened, but what it felt like. Not just what you think, but what you fear. Not just what you need, practically, but what you need emotionally from this person specifically, in a way that requires vulnerability to name and courage to ask for. And that kind of communication, the kind that builds and maintains real intimacy, is exactly what disappears when the invisible wall goes up. Stay with me through this video, because what I'm about to take you through is not a surface-level overview of communication tips. This is a deep examination of what actually happens, psychologically and emotionally, when a couple stops truly talking, what builds the wall brick by brick, and what it costs both people over time, and more importantly, what it actually takes to bring it down. If you are new to this channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this conversation is one of many in a series designed to take you somewhere most relationship content never goes, into the real, uncomfortable, genuinely transformative territory of what it means to be in an intimate partnership with another human being over the long arc of a life. Let me tell you about a couple named Sophie and James. They had been married for 11 years when Sophie first described to me what she called the feeling of talking to a wall. Not James specifically. She was careful about that, thoughtful in the way that people are when they love someone and are trying to be fair even in the middle of their own pain. Not talking to James like he was a wall, but talking into a space that used to feel alive and responsive, and that had, somewhere along the way, become something she could no longer feel on the other side of her words. James, when I spoke with him separately, described the same phenomenon from the other direction. He said that he had stopped sharing things with Sophie, not because he didn't want to, but because at some point he had stopped being able to predict what she needed from him when he shared them, whether she wanted him to listen or to solve, whether she wanted empathy or perspective, whether she wanted him to be present in the feeling with her or to help her move through it. And because he couldn't predict what was needed, because the attempts he had made to respond had so often landed wrong, had so often produced a reaction that felt like disappointment or frustration, he had quietly, gradually stopped initiating, had stopped offering, had begun to manage his own interior experience privately, because private management felt safer than the uncertainty of being responded to in a way that felt like failure. Two people, 11 years, the same wall, one experiencing it as absence, the other experiencing it as the exhaustion of not knowing how to be enough. And between them, invisible and solid and built one small missed moment at a time, a structure that neither of them had chosen and neither of them knew how to dismantle. This is the invisible wall. And understanding how it gets built, the actual psychological mechanism of its construction, is the first step toward understanding how it comes down. The wall does not begin with silence. It begins with something far more subtle and far more universal, something that every couple experiences and almost no couple ever talks about directly. It begins with the gradual accumulation of misattunement. Attunement, in the language of relationship psychology, is the experience of feeling genuinely met by another person, of saying something, of expressing a feeling, a need, a thought, a fear, and having the other person respond in a way that makes you feel seen, not agreed with necessarily, not validated in the sense of having your perspective confirmed as correct, but seen, recognized, responded to in a way that demonstrates that what you said landed, that it was received, that the person on the other side of your words was actually present when you spoke them. Misattunement is the opposite experience. It is the experience of reaching out and landing in empty space, of saying something and receiving a response that, however well-intentioned, misses the point of what was being communicated, of feeling, in the aftermath of a moment of attempted connection, more alone than you were before you tried. And here's the thing about misattunement that makes it so insidious. In small doses, it is entirely normal and entirely manageable. No two people are perfectly attuned to each other at all times. Every couple has moments of missing each other, of responding to what was said rather than what was meant, of being present in body but not quite in emotional frequency. These moments are inevitable, and in a relationship where the overall level of connection is high, they are easily absorbed. They cause a small ripple, and the ripple fades, and the connection reestablishes itself without either person having to work particularly hard to restore it. But in a relationship where the misattunement accumulates, where the moments of being missed start to outnumber the moments of being met, something begins to shift in the way both partners approach the act of reaching out. Something in the nervous system, something below the level of conscious decision begins to register that reaching out carries a risk, that the attempt to connect is as likely to produce disappointment as it is to produce the connection that was sought. And when that registration happens, when the body and the emotional system begin to associate reaching out with the anticipation of being missed, the reaching out begins to slow. The bids for connection become less frequent. The sharing becomes more selective. The inner life, which was once offered relatively freely, begins to be rationed. This is how the first bricks of the invisible wall are laid. Not through any decision to withdraw, not through anger or resentment or the conscious choice to stop being intimate, but through the slow, cumulative, entirely unconscious process of self-protection that follows from repeated experiences of reaching out and not quite being met. Maybe this is already resonating with something you have lived, Maybe you can identify the feeling, the specific quality of the moment after you said something that mattered to you and received a response that missed it, the particular flatness of that moment, the small, quiet decision that followed it, not quite a decision, more like a reflex, to file that particular feeling away privately next time. To not try that specific kind of sharing again, at least not for a while. And maybe, if you sit with it, you can also identify the times you were on the other side of that moment. The times when your partner reached out in some way, not always with words, not always explicitly, but reached out nonetheless. And you missed it, not cruelly, not intentionally, but you were tired or distracted, or you responded to the surface content of what they said rather than the emotional undertone beneath it. And afterward, there was a quality of flatness between you that you noticed but didn't quite know how to name or address. Because the wall is built from both sides simultaneously, it is never constructed by only one person. It is always the result of a mutual, reciprocal process of gradually closing. Each person's closing making the other person's closing feel more necessary, more rational, more self-protective. The wall becomes over time a shared structure, a jointly constructed architecture of managed distance that both partners have contributed to and neither partner feels fully responsible for, because from inside it, it is almost impossible to see how your own bricks got there. But there is a layer beneath this that almost no one identifies, even in the most honest conversations couples have about their disconnection. Because the misattunement story, the story of reaching out and not being met, is the visible part of the wall's construction. It is real and it is important, and it explains a great deal, but it does not explain everything. It does not explain why the misattunement was not addressed when it happened, why neither partner said at any of those moments of missed connection, "That didn't land right for me. Can we try again?" Why the missed moments were absorbed in silence rather than named in real time and corrected. And the answer to that question takes us somewhere deeper, somewhere that has less to do with the current relationship and more to do with what both people brought into it, the emotional templates, the learned patterns of relating, the deeply ingrained beliefs about what is and isn't safe to say in an intimate relationship that were formed long before Sophie and James ever met. Sophie grew up in a home that was emotionally warm but conflict-averse. Her parents loved each other. She was certain of that. And they loved her. But disagreement in that home was handled through a particular kind of graceful avoidance, a cultural and familial norm of not pressing on tender things, of letting difficult moments pass without examination, of maintaining the harmony of the surface by leaving the depths undisturbed. Sophie had absorbed this norm completely and unconsciously. She had learned that love and comfort were maintained through a kind of careful emotional management, that the way you kept people close was by not burdening them with the full weight of your interior experience, that being easy to be with was a form of love. And so when James missed her, when he responded to her reaching out in a way that didn't quite land, Sophie's learned response was not to say so, was not to flag the misattunement, to name it, to give him the information he needed to try again differently. Her learned response was to adjust, to make herself easier, to find a way to need less, or to need it differently, or to meet the need herself, so that the gap between what she had reached for and what she had received became less visible, less of a burden, less of a thing that required anyone else's attention. James, for his part, had grown up in a home where emotional expression by men was coded as weakness. Not through any explicit message, his father was not a harsh or dismissive man, but through the quiet, consistent modeling of a masculinity that managed difficulty through competence and action rather than through feeling and speech. James had learned to respond to emotional challenge by solving, by fixing, by doing, and had learned by extension that his value in a relationship was located primarily in his capacity to make things better. When Sophie reached out emotionally and he couldn't identify what would make it better, when the problem didn't have a solution he could execute, he experienced a specific and uncomfortable form of helplessness that he had been conditioned to avoid at almost any cost, and so he deflected. He offered practical responses to emotional needs. He moved the conversation toward the actionable, the manageable, the domain where he knew how to be useful. And Sophie, receiving his practicality when she had reached for presence, felt missed and adjusted herself to need less again and said nothing about it again. Two people. Two completely different sets of learned emotional strategies. Both of those strategies entirely rational within the context of the families that produced them. Both of those strategies brought into contact with each other in the specific intimacy of a long-term marriage, producing, inevitably, predictably, without malice from either side, the invisible wall. This is the point where everything can change, or not change. This is the exact moment in the understanding of a marriage where the insight either becomes the beginning of something new or gets filed away as interesting and remains inert. And the difference between those two outcomes, between insight that transforms and insight that merely informs, is almost never about intelligence or awareness or even motivation. It is about whether the insight is accompanied by a structure, a practical, specific, usable framework for translating the understanding into different behavior in the actual daily moments of the marriage. This is precisely what I built the ebook around, the translation problem, the gap between knowing what is happening in your marriage and knowing what to actually do differently on a Tuesday evening when the old pattern reasserts itself and the wall goes up again before either of you has noticed it happening. The ebook contains a specific framework for identifying the misattunement moments in real time, for catching them as they happen rather than processing them in retrospect, and a set of concrete, low-pressure practices for responding to them differently. Not perfectly, not with the fluency of someone who has been doing this work for years, but differently enough, consistently enough, to begin shifting the emotional climate of the marriage in a direction that makes the wall less necessary for both people. The link is in the description. I will come back to it. But right now there is something even more important I need to show you, because we have identified how the wall gets built, and we have touched on the childhood roots of the patterns that build it. But we have not yet looked at what the wall actually does to both people over time, what it costs, what it takes, what it creates in the interior landscape of each partner that, if left unaddressed, makes the dismantling of the wall feel not just difficult but genuinely terrifying. Because here is what almost no one tells you about the invisible wall. After it has been standing long enough, both partners begin to need it. Aqui está a parte 2, continuação e conclusão. This is the part that surprises people most, the part that feels counterintuitive when you first encounter it, because from the outside, and even from the inside, In the conscious, rational layer of how both partners experienced the marriage, the wall is clearly the problem. It is clearly the thing that is causing the pain, the disconnection, the loneliness that both people are living with. And yet, after it has been standing for long enough, after both people have reorganized their emotional lives around its presence, the wall becomes something more complex than simply an obstacle. It becomes, for both partners, a form of protection that they have come to rely on without fully realizing they have done so. Think about what the wall provides. For Sophie, it provided relief from the exhausting cycle of reaching out and being missed. Once she stopped reaching out, once she adjusted her needs downward and began managing her interior life primarily on her own, she stopped experiencing the specific pain of misattunement, the flatness that followed a missed connection, the quiet grief of feeling invisible to the person who was supposed to know her best. By stopping the reaching, she stopped the missing, and the absence of that specific pain, even though it came at the cost of the connection she had been reaching for, felt, at a purely physiological level, like a reduction in suffering. For James, the wall provided relief from the helplessness, from the specific, deeply uncomfortable experience of his wife's unmet emotional need existing in the space between them and his inability to resolve it. Once Sophie stopped expressing those needs, once she became easier, more self-contained, less visibly requiring of things he didn't know how to give, James felt the pressure lift, not consciously, not in a way he would have named as relief if you had asked him directly, but in the way that the nervous system responds to the removal of a chronic stressor, with a settling, a quieting, a return to a baseline that felt, compared to the tension that preceded it, like calm. Two people, the same wall, both of them, in their own way, made more comfortable by its presence than they had been by the painful, uncertain, vulnerability-laden process of genuine connection that preceded it. And this is why the invisible wall is so much harder to dismantle than most relationship advice acknowledges, because you are not simply asking two people to communicate better. You are asking them to voluntarily re-enter a territory of emotional risk and uncertainty that they exited at some level, because the exiting felt like relief. You are asking them to give up a protection that their nervous systems have come to rely on. And that is a fundamentally different ask from simply learning new communication skills, because it requires not just new behavior, but a willingness to tolerate the discomfort that the new behavior will inevitably produce before the benefits of it become visible. Sophie knew this, even if she couldn't have articulated it in these terms, on the evening she decided to try something different. It was a Saturday afternoon. James was in the garden, doing the kind of focused, solitary outdoor work that he found genuinely restorative. Sophie was inside, moving through the house with the quality of restlessness she had learned to manage privately, the feeling of something wanting to be said that had learned over years not to expect an audience. She stood at the kitchen window watching him for a long moment, and she noticed something she had not allowed herself to notice in a very long time. She noticed that she missed him, not in the abstract, retrospective way she had been missing the marriage, the grieving of something already lost, but in the present tense, the active, immediate, slightly frightening present tense of a woman who was looking at her husband through a window and feeling, alongside all the accumulated distance and all the protective adjustment and all the learned smallness of her own needs, something that was unmistakably still love. She went outside. She sat down on the garden bench near where he was working, and she didn't say anything at first, just sat. And after a moment, James looked up, registered her presence with the slight wariness of a man who had learned that his wife's proximity sometimes preceded a conversation he wouldn't know how to navigate, and then returned to what he was doing. And Sophie said, not with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed this, not with the therapeutic language of a person who had been working on their communication skills, but with the slightly unsteady voice of someone saying something true for the first time in a long time. I miss talking to you. I don't mean about logistics. I mean actually talking, the way we used to. James stopped what he was doing. He stood up slowly, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not with the immediate opening that Sophie might have hoped for in a more optimistic moment, but shifted. The wariness receded slightly, replaced by something more uncertain, more genuine. He said, I didn't think you wanted that anymore. And there it was, the same revelation that surfaces in slightly different forms in almost every marriage I have encountered that has been living inside the invisible wall for an extended period of time. The mutual misreading, each person interpreting the other's protective withdrawal as a statement about desire, as evidence that the other person had stopped wanting the connection, rather than recognizing it as the mirror image of their own self-protection. James had read Sophie's adjustment, her learned smallness, her careful management of her own needs as contentment, as evidence that she was fine with the distance, that she had perhaps always preferred things this way. And Sophie had read James's deflection and his practicality and his retreat into the solvable and the manageable as evidence that he had never been particularly interested in the kind of deep, present, emotionally resonant connection she had been craving. Both of them wrong, both of them lonely, both of them for years grieving a connection that the other person still wanted, and neither one knowing it, because the wall had made the wanting invisible. This is the moment that the invisible wall reveals its most fundamental nature. It is not at its core a barrier between two people who have grown apart. It is a barrier between two people who have both been too afraid to show the other how much they still want to be close. The wall is not made of indifference. It is made of fear wearing the costume of indifference. And when that costume comes off, when one person finds the courage to say the true thing, as Sophie did on that garden bench, the fear beneath it is almost always met with the recognition that the other person has been carrying the same fear all along. But I want to be honest with you about what happens next, because the recognition alone, the discovery that the longing is mutual, that the wall was built from fear rather than from the death of love, is not sufficient to bring the wall down. It is necessary, it is the beginning of everything, but it is not enough on its own. Because the wall, as we have established, has become a structure that both people's emotional systems have organized around, and dismantling it requires more than the willingness to try. It requires the development of specific capacities that the wall, by its very existence, has prevented both people from practicing. The first of those capacities is what I want to call tolerating the reopening. Because when the wall begins to come down, when the first honest conversation happens and the distance begins to close, both partners will experience something that feels paradoxically like more discomfort, not less. The return of emotional proximity after a long period of managed distance activates all the vulnerability that the distance was designed to protect against. The fear of misattunement returns because the possibility of being missed only exists when you are reaching out. The fear of being too much returns because the possibility of overwhelming your partner only exists when you are actually present with your partner. The fear of not being enough returns because the possibility of failing the other person only exists when you are genuinely trying to meet them. This is why so many couples who have a breakthrough conversation, who break the silence, who name the longing, who discover that the wall was built from mutual fear rather than mutual indifference, find themselves within days or weeks slipping back into the old distance, not because the breakthrough wasn't real, not because the desire for connection wasn't genuine, but because the re-entry into emotional proximity triggered the very fears that built the wall in the first place, and neither partner had developed the capacity to tolerate those fears without returning to the familiar relief of the managed distance. Tolerating the reopening means developing the ability to feel the fear of being missed, of being too much, of not being enough, and to stay present anyway. To stay in the discomfort of genuine intimacy rather than retreating to the comfort of the wall. And this is not something that happens through willpower alone. It happens through repeated small practices of staying, of choosing, in the moments when the reflex to close is strongest, to remain open instead. Each time you do it, the tolerance grows slightly. Each time you stay, the fear loses a small amount of its power. And over time, not quickly, but genuinely and cumulatively, the emotional system begins to register that proximity is survivable, that the vulnerability does not destroy you, that the risk of being met imperfectly is worth taking for the possibility of being met at all. James and Sophie did not dismantle the wall in a single afternoon in the garden. What happened on that bench was the first brick coming loose, a single moment of honesty that created a small opening. And in the weeks that followed, they worked at that opening together, imperfectly and inconsistently, in the way that all real relationship work happens, not in a straight line toward improvement, but in the jagged, 2 steps forward, 1 step back rhythm of two people trying to relearn something they had forgotten. There were evenings where James tried to respond to Sophie's emotional sharing and defaulted, despite his intention, to the practical and the solvable. And Sophie, instead of adjusting as she had always done, would say, gently, without accusation, but clearly, "I don't need a solution right now. I just need you to be here with me for a minute." And James would put down the solution and stay. Uncomfortable at first, uncertain of what staying without solving looked like, but present, learning, through the practice of it, what it felt like to be useful to his wife, not through competence, but through presence. And there were evenings where Sophie reached out in the old way, the careful, minimized, easy-to-receive way that asked for less than she actually needed. And James, who was learning to read the undertone beneath the surface of her words, would say, "That sounds like it was harder than you're making it sound. Tell me what it actually felt like." And Sophie, surprised every time by the invitation, would take a breath and tell him, not perfectly, not without the old self-consciousness of a person who had spent years making herself smaller, but more than she had before, more than she had thought he wanted. This is what the dismantling of the invisible wall actually looks like. Not the grand gesture, not the single transformative conversation, but this, two people, repeatedly, in the small ordinary moments of a shared life, choosing to practice something slightly different from what they have always done. Choosing presence over efficiency, choosing the question over the assumption, choosing to stay in the discomfort of genuine emotional contact rather than retreating to the familiar relief of managed distance. And here is what accumulates from that practice over time that no one who is still inside the wall can quite believe until they have experienced it themselves: safety. A new, earned, tested form of emotional safety that is qualitatively different from the safety of the wall. The wall offers safety through the elimination of risk. By making connection impossible, it makes the pain of failed connection impossible too. But the safety that builds through the practice of staying is something else entirely. It is the safety of a person who has reached out and been met, repeatedly, imperfectly but genuinely, until the reaching out no longer feels like a gamble. Until the other person's presence has been proven trustworthy, not through promises, but through the accumulated evidence of 100 small moments of actually showing up. That safety, built through practice, through patience, through the willingness to be bad at this for long enough that you eventually get better at it, is the foundation of real intimacy. Not the chemistry of the early relationship, not the effortless closeness of two people who are still in the neurochemical flood of new love, but the deep, durable, genuinely sustaining closeness of two people who know each other, who have seen each other in the difficult moments and stayed, who have been missed and have repaired it, who have been afraid and have chosen presence over protection anyway. This is what is on the other side of the invisible wall. And I want you to understand that it is not a return to the beginning. It is not the recovery of something lost. It is the creation of something new. Something that could not have existed at the beginning of the relationship because it requires exactly the difficulty and the struggle and the fear and the choosing that the early years did not demand. The wall, as devastating as it is, also contains within it the raw material of a deeper intimacy than the relationship might otherwise have achieved. Because the couples who dismantle it together, who go through the fear and the vulnerability and the imperfect practice of reopening, come out the other side knowing each other in a way that only that particular journey makes possible. I said earlier that applying this work alone can be genuinely hard. That the gap between understanding what needs to change and knowing how to change it in the actual daily texture of a marriage is one of the most challenging gaps there is. And I want to come back to that now, because if you have been watching this video and recognizing your marriage in Sophie and James's story, if you can feel the wall that exists between you and your partner, even if you have never had language for it before today, then what you need is not more understanding. You already have the understanding. What you need is the structure that translates the understanding into action. The ebook goes through the exact practices that Sophie and James used, the specific questions, the specific language frameworks, the specific weekly rituals that begin rebuilding emotional contact in a way that is low pressure enough for the avoidant partner and substantial enough for the partner who has been hungry for connection. It includes a detailed guide to identifying your own side of the wall, the specific ways your particular history has shaped your particular patterns of closing, so that you can begin to interrupt those patterns before they complete themselves. And it includes something I call the re-entry protocol, a structured approach to the first honest conversations after a long period of managed distance, designed specifically to reduce the risk of those conversations triggering the defensiveness and flooding that send both partners back behind their walls before the opening has had time to do anything. The link is in the description. This is the next step for the person who is ready to move from recognition to action, from watching to doing, from understanding the wall to actually, brick by brick, bringing it down. As we reach the end of this video, I want to leave you with something that I hope you will carry with you beyond the screen. The invisible wall in your marriage, if it is there and if you have recognized it today, is not a sign that the love is gone. It is not a verdict on the relationship or on either of you as people. It is a sign that two human beings, doing their best with the emotional tools they were given, have built a structure of self-protection that has outlived its usefulness. That was never meant to be permanent. That was always, at its core, a response to fear. And fear, when it is met with enough patience and enough courage and enough genuine willingness to stay, eventually yields. The wall came up quietly. It will come down the same way. Not in a single dramatic moment of demolition, but in the slow, steady, daily practice of choosing each other, of asking the real question instead of the safe one, of staying in the room, emotionally, not just physically, when everything in you wants to retreat to the familiar comfort of the managed distance. Sophie and James are still working at it, some weeks better than others, some conversations landing cleanly, others landing wide of the mark and requiring repair. But the wall is thinner than it was. The openings in it are wider. And on the evenings when James puts down the solution and simply sits with her, when Sophie takes a breath and tells him what it actually felt like instead of the easier version, on those evenings something in both of them recognizes what they had almost let themselves forget was still there. It is still there. In your marriage too, if you are willing to look for it. Beneath the logistics and the routine and the managed distance and the wall that neither of you chose and both of you built, it is still there, waiting not for a perfect moment or a perfect conversation or a version of either of you that has figured all of this out. Waiting simply for the willingness to begin. If you are ready to begin with structure and support rather than alone, the ebook is there for you. The link is in the description. It is called The Shadow of Marriage, and it was made for exactly this, for the person standing at the wall, hand on the first brick, ready to start. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and turn on notifications. This series continues, and each video goes somewhere the last one didn't. You deserve a space where these conversations happen with honesty and depth and genuine care for what you are carrying. This is that space. The wall is not the end of your story. It is the part of the story where you decide what kind of love you are willing to build. And the most important thing I can tell you about that decision is this: it is never too late to make it. The first brick can come loose today, with a single true sentence, with a single moment of choosing presence over protection, with the simple, courageous act of saying to the person on the other side of the wall, I am still here, and I still want to find you.